Good morning, everybody, to day 2 of NORA 3 online. My name is Hein Sas. I'm a member of the organization committee and I have the honor of opening day 2. Yesterday we had a pretty intensive day. I will not try to repeat, of course, all the proceedings. That's a waste of time. I need to be brief, as everybody needs to be brief on online meetings. So, a short introduction. By the way, if you miss day 1, and for everybody who is going to miss day 2, the whole meeting is being recorded and being sent on our YouTube channel later on. The link will appear on the website after the conference. Yes, well, we have at this moment, the number of participants is still increasing to 104 at this moment. Yes, may I have that first slide? So, an update also of the slide of yesterday. We have 196 registrations from 20 countries. Even outside Europe, NORA, of course, is a European organization, so a very, very warm welcome to all people who have logged on to this conference from China, Hong Kong, Pakistan, Australia, New Zealand. It's evening there now. I think in New Zealand even pretty late in the evening. And of course from the USA, I think in total 7 people from the USA. It's rather very early morning in the USA. So thank you for being there. Thank you for being awake. And as you see, we have an interesting distribution all over Europe. 13 European countries, United Kingdom, you can say the front runner also time-wise. Native oyster restoration started pretty early there, so you can see that, and there's also a very strong network organization in the UK, and as we saw yesterday, many products already arriving to us, to the whole community, to the whole NORA community. And maybe interestingly, you see on the other side of the North Sea, maybe a bit too much concentration around the North Sea still. We need to engage also people and projects more in the Mediterranean and to the south of the Channel. But as you can see, rather around the North Sea, there's quite a lot of interest and indeed quite a lot of projects. So I would say NORA is filling a little bit of the gap which the Brexit is going to leave behind. Having said this, I think it's clear enough where the registrations come from. Oh yeah, one thing. Yesterday we had 80% of presence, so people logged in compared to the registrations, which I think is a very high number because many people are working from home, they have other tasks and challenges and maybe also temptations. And already now we are at 114. We arrived at almost 150 yesterday. So a great, true, well, you can say actual interest in our meeting. I hope the same happens today. Now, something about the participation. How do you do that? May I have next slide, please? Right, well, be present is logical. Feel free to move around. You can move around. You can also sit behind the screen in your pajamas and have your pets around you, because if you are not a presenter, nor a chairperson, you will not be seen or heard. That, of course, it may also be a bit unfortunate, but that is the restriction, of course, of an online conference. You can ask during and after presentations questions via the Q&A button at the webinar toolbar, usually at the bottom of your screen. And you can vote for the questions you like answered by clicking on the thumbs up symbol. Please scroll down so that you see all the questions asked, because the panel is limited, the panel size, and if you scroll down you see all the questions, so that you can see which questions you can really prioritize. Unanswered questions will be shared with the presenters after the conference. There's even closed captioning, that is so subtitles. If you do not master English language very well, you can click on the closed caption CC button on the bottom of your toolbar so that you get English subtitles. And of course, tweeting and retweeting is very much appreciated. Well, I leave it to that. Have a very good and, of course, intense day. And I give the word now to the floor, really, to the chair of the next session, which is William Sanderson. He is Master Reader and Associate Professor of Marine Biodiversity at the Heriot-Watt University. He's also the Research Director of the very interesting and important Dornoch Environmental Enhancement Project, where, of course, native oysters are being deployed in great numbers, and we think to great effect, to great benefit for the nature restoration there. He organized NORA 2 in Edinburgh with lots of success last year. And of course, Bill is a member of the NORA Advisory Board. Well, Bill, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hein. That's great. I have the great pleasure this morning of introducing our keynote speakers. So we have, in the first session, we have Anne Birch, who joined the Nature Conservancy, the TNC, in 2004. And she's the TNC's Marine Program Manager in Florida. She's responsible for guiding work on restoring and managing coastal systems, and that includes habitat restoration as well, management and policy actions. And she's convening diverse stakeholders to tackle issues affecting Florida's estuarine systems. So Anne is currently managing a large-scale oyster restoration project and development of an ecosystem-based fishery management plan for the greater Pensacola Bay system in Florida. We also have a double act today. So Laura Geselbracht serves as a scientific advisor to the Southeast Florida Climate Change Compact. And I just have to be careful here. Apalachicola Bay System. And this is a statewide ecosystem assessment of coastal and aquatic resources. So Florida Oyster Recovery Science Working Group, and also on several Nature Conservancy projects. She previously served on the board of the Florida Ocean Alliance for 5 years. So we have some very well experienced, excellent keynote speakers this morning to kick off with. So I believe the first presentation will run now.
Good morning, joining you with a cup of coffee. It's a pleasure and an honor to be invited to speak with you today and present on exciting work we have underway in the Pensacola Bay system in Florida, in which stakeholder participation is not only desired, but a necessary process for the recovery of oysters. Findings from the Shellfish Reefs at Risk report published in 2011 remains one of the most influential publications to identify the global decline of shellfish reefs, namely oysters, and recommend actions for their recovery. Although there's been a lot of very good restoration projects accomplished since this study, we are failing to apply comprehensive and sustainable reef management strategies. I'll focus the remainder of my talk on the Pensacola Bay system and how the Nature Conservancy is working with the local community to design a science-based and actionable management plan for the recovery of the area's once vibrant oyster habitat and fishery. So last year, we launched a community stakeholder process to develop an ecosystem-based fishery management plan, or EBFM for short. This project is tackling these three fundamental questions. Where are we now? We need to assess the current status of oysters in the bay and the condition of the bay itself. Where do we want to be? We want to create a community vision for the recovery of oysters. And how do we get there? We need to identify key actions needed to reach the vision and identify those who are responsible for implementing those actions. So where are we now? Well, Florida's oyster fishery has been on a steady decline due to a variety of stresses noted in the arrows along the bottom of the screen. This same decline in the oyster fishery is mirrored in the Pensacola Bay system. But there is hope. There's a remnant oyster fishery and a community that is proud of their fishing heritage and the natural resources and understands the importance oysters play in maintaining a healthy bay. For the purposes of Pensacola, we defined EBFM as the integration of these three essential elements: a wild harvest oyster fishery, oyster aquaculture, and oyster habitat. We identified four primary principles of the process. It's important that it be, first of all, developed by the community. This is not a T&C plan. It needs to be open and transparent to allow all voices to be heard. Include multiple objectives to address each of these three elements, and achieve consensus support of the final plan. Currently, there is not a statewide oyster management or restoration plan for Florida to serve as a guide. So in discussions with the state management agencies, we agreed to start the planning at the bay scale, since each bay has a unique oyster population, conditions, industry, and local community support. Effective management planning should consider the fishery and the habitat for the full suite of services they provide. It should be science-based and actionable. This is not a plan that feels good during development and then lives its life out collecting dust on a shelf. And most importantly, it needs to be community-driven. A critical first step was to meet with key individuals in the Bay to hear their thoughts on development of a plan. Did they want one? And if so, who's the right entity to lead its development? We also conducted interviews with 80 stakeholders from diverse interest groups and agencies. And this is a photo of one of the first meetings we held, which was with the oyster fishers. There was unanimous and enthusiastic support for a plan among everyone interviewed. The timing was right. It was overdue, and they supported the Conservancy leading the process. So in case your coffee and tea hasn't kicked in yet, the most important ingredient of the planning process is the community. So the next step was to convene a stakeholder working group. We purposefully invited people who represent community interests that are or may be affected by the plan, and community influencers, who are those individuals who could make or break the success of the plan. We also contracted with a professional facilitation company, Facilitated Solutions, to run the meetings. The working group's role is to identify and agree on a suite of actionable recommendations for management and restoration of oysters in the Bay that are informed by the best available science and stakeholders' experiences, such as the watermen, and to identify entities willing to be responsible for implementing the plan. The working group's guiding principles are, first of all, to serve as a liaison to the stakeholder group that they've been appointed to represent. They worked together collaboratively to seek to understand and respect their differing perspectives, operate under procedures that are clear and consistently and equitably applied to all members of the group, and achieve consensus on the recommendations for the final plan. Essential to the implementation of the plan is the involvement of the state and local agencies that are responsible for management of the oyster fishery and the Bay's resources. Our established relationships with them before the planning has been really helpful. It's created trust and a shared commitment to the process and the outcome. The Nature Conservancy's role is to identify and convene the members of the working group. We compile and interpret science and research for the working group members to assess. We provide drafts of their ideas and comments for their review and editing at every meeting. We consult with the agency resource managers on regulatory and management actions needed to implement the plan. And we're providing funding that is making this process a reality. So thank you again so much for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. I'll now turn it over to Laura Geselbracht to describe how science is being integrated as an essential element of the planning process. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and good morning. Today, I will tell you a little bit about the science products we've developed to help our working group in the construction of an ecosystem-based fisheries management plan for oysters in the Pensacola Bay system. We have two products that we've developed. One is the oyster habitat suitability model, and the second one is the spatial management plan for oyster habitat and fisheries restoration. First, the oyster habitat suitability model. The habitat suitability model is a spatial model, and it utilizes several factors to identify the most suitable areas for oyster reef restoration. We looked at 22 different biological, chemical, and physical factors and ended up selecting 7 due to their relevance and the availability of good spatial data. We scored each of these factors between 0 and 1 to keep the different factors on an equal basis. We have 2 factors that are not part of the spatial model, but they provide us with visual assistance. Here's one of the factors we included, minimum bottom dissolved oxygen. And we looked at the period from 2015 to January 2020. And we scored this factor from 0 to 1 based on how well these factors correspond to oyster viability. And the green area is the most viable, the red area is the least viable, and the yellow, an intermediate viability. Here's the final oyster habitat suitability model. And how we created that was to take each of those 7 factors in the model, add them up spatially, and divided them by 7 to keep the score between 0 and 1. You can see there's quite a bit of area in the midsections of the bay that seem fairly suitable, in green in particular, yellow a little bit less suitable. And then the second product we developed was the spatial management plan. And we took 4 pieces of information: the oyster habitat suitability model, current shellfish management areas. There's 2 different designations: prohibited harvest areas and conditionally approved harvest areas. The conditionally approved harvest areas are usually open, but they will be closed if bacterial conditions decline in the system. And that is done to protect human health. Also, contemporary reefs, as identified by our oyster fishers in the system, as well as our state agency that does oyster reef mapping, and areas to be avoided, everything from navigation channels to aquaculture release areas, and also a dissolved oxygen caution area that was identified by our oyster fishers. When we put these 4 pieces of information together, what we get are both the conditionally approved harvest areas in the central part of the bay system and the prohibited harvest areas that are underneath the hatched lines. And I've broken it down here by suitability, the green being most promising or most suitable. In the conditionally approved harvest areas, that would be most suitable for restoring oyster reefs for harvesting. We have over 7,600 hectares available for restoration. It's not to say that all of these areas would be highly suitable, because it would also depend on the bottom type. Culching really can only take place on hard bottom to be effective. And then we also have the prohibited harvest areas under the hatched lines. In the most suitable or most promising category, we have almost 1,700 hectares available for restoration of reefs here. These would most likely be things like larval source area reefs, reefs for sport fishing of finfish, and reefs for water quality improvement. Some of the yellow areas and possibly some of the orange areas may also be suitable for oyster reef restoration, but these would have to be examined a little more thoroughly through field investigations as well as water quality investigations. So in summary, there's a lot of area available for oyster reef restoration in this system. We are just about to start some bottom mapping to identify areas of oyster reef and the condition of those reefs, if there's live oysters and what their sizes are. That information will help us refine our oyster habitat suitability model and the spatial area management plan. Each bay system is unique. They'll have unique biological, chemical, and physical factors, as well as whatever spatial data is available for those systems. Social and economic factors could be included with the habitat suitability model. We decided just to look at factors that affected the viability of oysters, but you could have things like proximity to docks or proximity to where oyster fishers may deliver their catch, and things of that nature that could help identify optimal areas for business practices. And finally, this analysis can be adjusted for surface aquaculture by changing out some of the factors. So instead of including something like dissolved oxygen on the bottom, you would include dissolved oxygen at the surface so that you're getting the most accurate information on water quality conditions in the system for aquaculture, surface aquaculture. So on behalf of Ann Birch and myself, we thank you very much for inviting us to this conference, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I would like to move on to the questions and answers session now. So I'm just checking the list of questions that have come in whilst those the speakers have been presenting. So the first question is at the top of the list is from Luca van der Ren, and the question is, generally the US oysters are intertidal and hence visible to people. You see the ecosystem services and you can directly appreciate the effects on biodiversity. The European flat oyster grows predominantly offshore in waters only accessible to experienced divers. How can you involve stakeholders better for this species?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a really good one. We have subtidal oysters here in Florida in places. The one way that we've done that is to engage the stakeholders, obviously on land, by getting them together to help just vet the, say, a restoration project design. We've put together technical committees of different stakeholders to let them know what we're trying to do and to see if they have any input on the design. The other ways is you can hold just public information sessions. I mean, what we found is that the minute we start talking oysters, we have a lot of people very interested from all ages and backgrounds. There's nobody that is not interested that we found. So it's just finding the way to bring them into a project, even though they can't go out in the water and see it themselves.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got another question here, which is very popular from Ernst Schriver, and that's what are your recommendations on involving non-fishing communities in the oyster reef restoration projects?
Yeah, I don't think that there's any issue in involving non-fishing folks. We have done some intertidal reef restoration projects where we've been able to include people in the development of the project design, the materials that have been used, and this is all onshore. And again, outreach and just education on what we're doing. If you put the word out and you are providing a space for people to come and learn about what you're doing, a lot of times that is enough. They don't have to have hands-on. Although if there are opportunities at any stage of a project, whether it's intertidal or subtidal, doesn't matter. If you're developing materials that will go into subtidal and you're developing them onshore, if there's a way for you to involve people in the creation of those materials at any little step, people will really appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. That's really great. So one of the questions that comes from actually Joanne Preston here is, did you find it took a while, and this is something I've found quite interesting myself, is how long did it take you to build trust with the watermen and the wider stakeholders? Was it a protracted process?
Yeah, that is a great question, and relationship building does take time. You can't just walk into an area that you haven't been working in and expect people to wrap their arms around you and embrace what you're doing. So take the time that you need to understand who are the key people in the community that you need to reach, whether they're decision makers, the watermen themselves, people who work directly with the watermen, and that's what we found in Pensacola Bay. We are working with an agency that trains the watermen, so they are the liaison with us to those watermen, and they arrange the meetings that we have with them, give us a space to talk with them. So it takes time, and I would not skirt that timing, you know, that relationship building, because in the end, that will, you know, come back to you in spades for advancing any project. So develop the relationships, understand who can make or break, again, what I mentioned in the talk, make or break the success of what you're trying to do. So don't shy away from people who are necessarily naysayers at the beginning. Find out what their issues are and address them directly and openly.
Great, thank you very much. So Corina Peter has a question about the negative feedback that you might have received from the community and stakeholders. And I know this can be really important sometimes. I remember Billy Causey telling me that at one point during the establishment of the Florida Keys Marine Sanctuary, somebody was burning an effigy of him outside his office. So Corina Peter here is asking, you know, what was the negative feedback that you had from the community, and how did you deal with it?
So surprisingly, in Pensacola Bay, we have had zero negative feedback. You know, the Florida Keys are a whole different issue. There was a protection efforts going on, you know, regulations. This is not a regulatory approach. So this is a planning approach. The people in the estuaries where oysters have occurred and the oyster fishery have occurred have collapsed everywhere. And people that live in these communities understand that and understand the importance of it and want to see how the bay can be restored. So oysters are becoming, you know, a celebrity, so to speak, within these bay systems. And we have had zero really negative feedback. If we did, again, going back to the previous question, what we would do is sit down with those people and really try to understand where they're coming from and what's at the heart of the issues. And a lot of times what you find is that you might be having the same understanding of what you want to achieve in the end, but you're speaking a different language. You're not understanding the processes that each of you are wanting, you know, how to get there. And you can typically work it out. So again, that relationship building, sitting down one-on-one with people, really understanding and listening to what they're saying and not trying to barrel through your ideas. When you're working with a community, it has to come from that community. And so it is not you trying to put what you want on the community, but understanding what the community wants and then seeing how you can get there with them.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, I think a few of us can relate to that. I've got a question here from Juk Haringa, and the question is the habitat suitability model calibrated and validated? I guess it's about whether you ground truth it as well.
Yes, so it is definitely calibrated. For example, the dissolved oxygen component of the model is calibrated using more recent dissolved oxygen information in the last 5 years, for example, because one thing I noticed when we were putting this together was that that changed considerably over the last several decades. So as far as validation goes, we could only use existing information on recent oyster reefs. And in that spatial management plan, you'll notice one of the components we used were the existing reefs or recent reefs. We don't know exactly what's existing now. We're in the process of doing some bottom mapping, which will further validate the model. But as far as recent past oyster reefs go, it does seem to match up pretty nicely with what we know of existing reefs.
Great, thank you. So I've got a question here from Stéphane Pouvreau as well, and he says that was there a predation parameter in your suitability model? Because actually this is an issue for us in the European native oyster, is the problem with predators in certain places.
Very good question. We looked at that, and we, because predation and disease had been an issue previously with the oysters in the system, there weren't any good spatial data sets that represented that. But one thing, we also think that the dermo outbreaks that were suspected previously seem to have a very strong water quality component with them, like spills of pollutants that triggered this dermo outbreak. But now it's thought there's some question on whether there ever really was dermo outbreaks. There were 3 events over about 3 decades that completely wiped out the oysters from this system a few times. So it's a question, and we'll keep a close eye on that. And the nice thing about moving forward with this plan is if predation becomes a problem, it's something we could model more effectively than was done in the past. I'm sorry, not model, monitor more effectively.
Okay, great. So we have a question from Sweden now. This is Åsa Strand, and she's asking, did you experience a lot of conflict between interest groups, so between different stakeholder groups? So for example, tourism and fisheries versus aquaculture, and how did you manage these kind of interactions?
Yeah, again, I think Pensacola is a unique area where we have not experienced that in Pensacola. The stakeholders have come together, and I'll address this with another question in the chat, in the question and answer, that, you know, we have a professional facilitation company that we hired to facilitate the working group. And if that is feasible for people to do, if you're going to form a working group like this, and I suggest you do, that you have an external group that is neutral to the body, doesn't care what the outcome is, to facilitate, to make sure everybody has an equitable voice in the process. That's critical, because, you know, you may inadvertently start to favor one voice over another if you don't have somebody who is just neutral to the process doing that. So there are other bay systems like Apalachicola Bay, where the oyster fishery is very prominent. Historical, it's an icon. And yes, there are some conflicts there. And again, how they're handling that is with a professional facilitator, and actually the same one we're using in Pensacola Bay. So it's really important to figure out your system of communicating with stakeholders ahead of time. Map out how you're going to address each of the issues that you think might arise.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm just aware of the time. We have to start to move on, but you'd be pleased to know that you've stimulated a very long list of questions here. So I'm sure the organisers will make sure that you receive the list of unanswered questions so far after the session. But thank you very much to our keynote speakers there. That was really, really interesting. Great.
Thank you so much.
So, so now the next part of the conference is we have a report back from the working groups. So the working groups will run through a series of updates. We have the first one, which is the historical ecology group, then outreach, site selection, and then the production working group. So 4 working groups in a run here, starting with Ruth, Thurstan, and the historical ecology group.
Thanks very much, Bill. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for having me. My name is Ruth Thurstan, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Exeter in the UK. I'm delighted to use this opportunity to tell you a bit about the NORA Historical Ecology Working Group on the European native oyster. This group is open to anyone with an interest in understanding trends in native oyster abundance, distribution and trade through time. So whatever your discipline or expertise, if this topic interests you, and especially if you hold historical data that can help us in our work, please do get in touch. There are also further details on the NORA website. So the aim of this working group, if I can just, sorry, move along, there we go. The aim of this working group is to develop a sound quantitative and qualitative assessment of the historical distribution, trends and trade in the native oyster across Europe. As you may imagine, this is very much an interdisciplinary endeavour. We require perspectives from a range of disciplines to properly interpret the wide variety of data and sources we are in the process of finding. At present, we have researchers involved from approximately 14 countries across Europe, and data collection from online archives, public libraries, government records and museum collections is very much underway. As many of you will be aware, we have major gaps in our knowledge of, in our understanding of the past extent, the distribution, and even the structure of historical oyster habitats prior to intensive exploitation. By undertaking a historical ecology approach, we hope to move some way towards closing those knowledge gaps. In particular, we're in the process of gathering information on the characteristics of historical oyster habitats, where they existed and when these beds started to be exploited, how many were landed through time, and how much was paid for these oysters and what trade or movement of oysters took place in different time periods, and as well as the cultural as well as the provisioning importance of oysters across different parts of society. The sources we're using to come up with this information are pretty diverse. They include government archives, which are great sources of information for landings, trade, price trends, and locations of fisheries. Although, of course, with a few exceptions, they do not tend to provide information on pre-exploitation conditions. And most detail starts to be published when grounds either start providing commercial quantities of oysters, or the grounds are being denuded and concerns for the sustainability of the oyster fishery is rising. Historical and popular literature include sources such as naturalist accounts, newspaper and other sporadically published reports that weren't even necessarily focused upon oyster fishing per se, but they can provide some real gems on the past uses of oysters. Descriptions of the beds, and also importantly other social and ecological changes. So this quote is from Henry Mayhew's 19th century work, London Labour and the London Poor, which gives us a brief insight into the significance of oysters for this urban population during the mid-19th century. Of course, the research literature provides information on the presence and abundance of oysters and associated marine life, as well as illuminates past trends in landings and trends for particular locations. This literature is growing fast. It isn't restricted to science. It's also the humanities and other disciplines, of course, so not just the natural sciences. And then, of course, finally, museum collections are also extremely diverse. They can include shell collections, but also artwork and nautical charts, which help us understand locations as well as our past uses of oysters. So that's a brief taster of the work that we're getting up to in the Historical Ecology Working Group. We are meeting virtually on the 30th November and the 1st of December to work on the data that we have and to identify remaining knowledge gaps. So if you're interested in getting involved and if you have data that you can contribute to this or you can dedicate some time, please let me know. Thank you.
Hello everybody, thank you for joining this short presentation where I briefly introduce the NORA Outreach Group. My name is Corina Peter. I work in the German restoration projects where I'm involved in the transfer of knowledge, and I'm coordinating the NORA Outreach Group. So outreach work and the materials for it are of fundamental importance for restoration projects in order to raise awareness for the existence of the European native oyster and for the urgent need of its protection and restoration. And many of the projects in the NORA community already do outreach work. This includes, for example, working with school children in school classes, whether in the field or in the lab, or the design of comprehensible infographics. But of course, there are many other important ways how to conduct outreach work. And in this field, a lot of experiences really originates from conducting this work. And this is where the outreach group comes in. So our aim is to learn and benefit from the experiences of the other members. So it's really orientated on the needs of the group. So we want to share the experiences we made in the course of the outreach work within our projects, and thus let the other group members participate in our learning process. So it's learning by sharing, so to say. And the group should function as a platform for everyone to exchange the lessons learned from those outreach experiences. For example, what feedback did we get from the audience, which things worked, or also very important, which things didn't work. And in this way, the other members working on similar topics don't have to start from zero, and they can benefit from these experiences of the other group members. This all in future may then lead to even discussing new outreach ideas, either within single projects or even eventually together, and creating so-called NORA outreach materials. They can then be developed together, discussed together, and can be shared with everyone to be used in the single projects and then be shared on the NORA webpage, for example. And the meetings, they are scheduled every 2 months. So we have bi-monthly meetings. Normally they take place on the second last Tuesday. And in 2020, we already met for 3 meetings so far. That is pretty successful. And one more is planned for December. And so far we had 7 speakers in the meetings on different topics, and on average 4 to 10 people participated. And there's more room for more, so to say. For everyone interested, the topics of the next meeting are always shared on the NORA homepage, on Twitter, or if possible in the NORA newsletter. And if you missed a meeting or if you want to rewatch it, that's always possible because the videos are available online after the meeting and the talks are recorded. So you can always rewatch it. And of course, there's always the possibility to organize a smaller meeting in between with less people, or just people who are really working on the topic if something urgent comes up in one of the projects. What's for me really important to say is also that the meetings are really held in a friendly and familiar atmosphere, and they should therefore enhance creative thinking rather than just report or talk about the success of the outreach. So it's really also about exchanging what you learned from it and what didn't work. So to help others out to not make the same mistakes again, so to say, but to really benefit from this exchange. The next meeting is on December 8th, and we're happy to have Alec Reed there talking about community engagement and how they manage this within their projects in Ireland. And afterwards, we of course want to discuss if and how community engagement is part of other projects, so maybe of your project, and what you have to consider when planning it. So if you think your project could be represented there, or you could talk about the community engagement projects you have, please, we're happy if you join us. And further planning goes to the NORA 4 conference, where I hope we can meet again in person. And there we would like to plan a game night. And there we can all sit together in a relaxed atmosphere and get creative and develop games for kids of different age classes together. So if you want to join there in planning or organizing this, or if you already have some ideas for games in mind, please feel free to join us or contact us. So I hope you got a really short, really quick and good overview about what we're doing in this group so far. If you have any ideas or if you want to join us, please always contact me or the Secretariat. And thanks for listening.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anna Hughes. I'm a master's student at the University of Edinburgh. I'm presenting some new work today for a new working group on site selection. I'll be working with Verlene Zuermgassen to create a peer-reviewed publication to compile the most important factors for native oyster site selection across Europe. I will also be working with the Wild Oysters Project, who we heard from yesterday, at their new site in Largs in West Scotland, and they're going to feature as a case study within my project. The aim of this project is to collate existing information and expert opinion to produce a list of the most important factors in site selection for native oyster restoration projects. As I've already said, this will be a peer-reviewed publication, and we want it to be a single comprehensive document to make it easier for new projects that are starting up. So all the information will be in one place for them to refer to. Native oyster restoration is obviously a growing field, so there is demand at the moment for a document such as this. The basis of my project will be around the Delphi technique. This is a series of questionnaires that will be asked to experts from across Europe to try and highlight the most important factors in site selection. Feline has used this before on mangroves, so I'll be using her expertise and her contacts in this project. The first round will be asking experts which they think are the most important biotic, abiotic and social factors in site selection. A further 2 or 3 rounds will gather more information and move towards a consensus for the most important factors for site selection. I'll then cross-reference this with the literature to highlight any gaps and make sure that it's as comprehensive as possible. This is an open call. There's more details on the NORA website about this, so if you would like to be involved, please contact me. Our email addresses are on the final slide. And if we get full participation in the Delphi, we will be including you as an author, a co-author on the paper. My timescale is highlighted here. So I'm on a 1-year taught master's program. I'm starting this dissertation project now. The initial questionnaire will be sent out by the end of November. We'll then have 2 to 3 weeks reply time for each round. So this means that everyone will have time to answer fully, and I'll have time to do a bit of data processing. The Delphi will be finished by February 2021, and then hopefully the results will be ready to be presented at the NORA 4 conference in May next year. Throughout this time, I'll also be traveling to LARGs, hopefully to help out on their monitoring, get some field experience, and potentially do some community surveys. So here's our contact details. Please do email me at oystersiteselection@gmail.com, or you can contact Feline as well. So if you have any questions or if you'd like to be involved, please do let me know. We're also going to be on Twitter, so please do follow the thread of #NORA_site-selection. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm Åsa Strand. I work as a researcher at IVL, Swedish Environmental Research Institute. And I want to present to you today the production working group and the activities we've had so far. So just to provide a brief background to this working group, the challenges that we have identified is that, as we've been discussing during this conference, there's a lack of oyster seed and oysters for restoration efforts. There's also often a mismatch between funding timelines and seed production timelines. And obviously, there's biosecurity constraints for translocations. So the ambitions or the aims of this working group is to address these challenges and hurdles, to identify and understand the barriers in sourcing oysters for restoration efforts, and to find collaborative solutions between industry and projects to reduce these barriers. Because we're quite a newly formed working group, we haven't had that much activities. We have had one call for collaboration related to a spatting pond protocol, and we also participated in the development of the biosecurity guidelines. We also had the ambition to host a workshop at the Aquaculture Europe conference in Cork, Ireland, but that was obviously cancelled. So now we have decided to move this workshop online. So this is a save the date call. We plan to host this workshop Friday, December the 4th. And I'm really happy to see that this does not collide with any of the other meetings from the other working groups. If you are interested in joining this workshop, please contact the NORA Secretariat. Just to provide some more information about this workshop, the tentative agenda includes both presentations and discussion sessions. In terms of presentations, we aim to discuss requirements on oysters for restoration, as this may differ from requirements on oysters for aquaculture. We also aim to have the industry present their side of the story and provide some information about oyster seed production. And we also want to lift the perspective of payment for ecosystem services as a potential funding source for providing oyster seed for restoration projects. During the discussion sessions, we have the ambition to develop 2 different products. First of all, information sheets directed to the industry and to the restoration projects. So in terms of restoration projects, we think that it's important that the projects know about what restoration practitioners need to know about the oyster seed production industry. And similarly, we think that the industry would benefit from having a document stating what do oyster producers need to understand about oyster restoration. So we see this as a way of facilitating communication and enhanced understanding between these 2 activities. We also aim to develop a policy brief where we want to discuss the environmental benefits of oysters, discuss the oyster seed supply demands of restoration projects, current hurdles and knowledge gaps in terms of meeting this demand, and also possible strategies for supporting upscaling of oyster seed produced for oyster restoration. So if you think that any of this sounds interesting, I hope that you will register to participate in this workshop. You can send an email to me or to the Secretariat at noraeurope.eu. Or if you have any other ideas for additional activities we can do in this working group or want to join the work that we do, please let us know. We will be happy to include any participants. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all of our working group presenters there. Lots to think about. We now have 10 minutes available when we can ask questions of our speakers now. And I'll just move to the Q&A session. So I have a question to Ruth, which is including all of the archives of different languages and alphabets in Europe is a great challenge. And do you have an audience, members, or access to all of these archives? That's from
yes, that's a great question. Thank you. So I think the answer is that we are doing our best with that, but we certainly do welcome people who have access to archives. So I said that we've got about 14 countries from Europe involved at the moment. So that's people with a range of different languages and access to also a range of disciplinary expertise as well. So but what I would say is that if people have time and if they're not sure whether they might be doubling up on effort, please do contact me, because I think even where we have people covering certain areas, regions, certain languages, certain archives, they could possibly do with the help. So I think it would be, yeah, please get in touch. But we're doing our best on that, but it's not perfect yet, is a short answer.
Great, thank you. So whilst we've got you, Ruth, there's a second popular question here, which is how confident are we about the time period of the onset of the decline of oyster reefs? So basically, is the Olsen's piscatorial atlas, is that made at the time when fisheries had already made a significant effect on the seabed, in your opinion?
Well, so for the second part of that question, absolutely yes. Obviously, there were, particularly in those coastal areas, by that point, we'd been seeing complaints about scarcity in certain areas for at least 30 years. So I think that, again, the short answer is, unfortunately, is that it depends. So for certain areas, we do have quite extensive archive collections that give us a really good indication of when declines started to occur. People interviewed the fishing community and they would say when in their lifetimes they'd seen these declines, for example, but we don't have that for everywhere. So in some cases we're going to have to make assumptions by that. So we'll try and do that in the best way possible, and by triangulating as many data sources as we possibly can. And I did notice there was an answer there by Han for an answer on the Olsen data, so the article of F. Benema, so that's Floris Benema, and yes, he recently published a paper on oysters in the North Sea in the ICES Journal of Marine Science, so that's certainly a place to go to have a look at that, some very detailed work on the Olsen work there.
So we have a question for Corina now from Nicholas Arrojo Pinheiro. I hope we got that right. Do you think that funders and public institutions share, whoops, hang on, it's scrolling whilst I'm trying to read it. Do you think that funders and public institutions share that outreach plans are important and that these strategies are evaluated when are included in the project applications?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a really good one as well. So yes, I think that even in some project plans, it's already a mandatory part to include outreach work. I know from Germany, but I also know from some other European projects. And this means including any outreach work or citizen science, and also as this whole science communication at the moment gains momentum everywhere. I think it's getting bigger, and it will be more important also for proposals. So I think it's a big part also for funders that they want to have that in the proposals.
Okay, thank you. So we'll just move over to Åsa. So this is a question from Hein Sas, I think. The question is, I understand that there are many difficulties in producing healthy native oyster larvae in hatcheries. Does the working group aim to address these difficulties?
Well, we are sort of addressing it by working with different production methods. We're looking both at sea-based seed collection, working on spatting ponds, and of course hatchery production. But if this is a specific question that you would want us to address, then feel free to join our meetings, or I could raise this question with the group and see if we can have a specific activity related to this. If you have any suggestions of a more specific activity you would want to address, please let us know, and we could discuss this further.
Okay, thank you very much. So just moving over to Anna, we have a question from Oliver Tully here. So how does the site selection work relate to the oyster restoration manual that was presented yesterday? Assuming, of course, you've had time to read and digest it all.
So yeah, perfect. Thank you for the question. So the two are not directly related. They're taking on different formats, but mine will sort of be additive to the full handbook. I guess there'll be a lot of complementary information, and I imagine, depending on the results we get back from the open call, I imagine there'll be some crossover in the people involved. So there'll be some sharing of expertise there as well. But yeah, not directly related, but hopefully they'll complement each other nicely.
So there's one here which comes from Hein Sas again, which is, has the group been able to collect historical data from areas south of the channel, the English Channel, and down into the Mediterranean perhaps? And if yes, did the decline in oysters happen at the same time that we're familiar with in the North Sea region?
Yeah, great question, thank you. So the answer is we are collecting data south of the Channel. There are a few dedicated members of the working group working in particular areas of the Mediterranean, but it is also an area where we haven't got quite as many people working on that. So yes, the answer is we are doing our best to get data from south of the Channel. That's an important part of this project. As to whether the trends are different, I'll have to let you know in a month or so when we hold this, because that's when we're going to collate a lot of this data. So that's a good question, but unfortunately I can't answer it just yet.
I think I have a question here from Pierre Boudry, which is what about using historic native shells to extract DNA and trace ancient genetic history of the oysters in Europe?
Is that to me?
I think that is to you. Sorry, Ruth. Yes.
Yeah. No, that's, I think that's a fantastic idea. That's not my area of expertise, unfortunately, but I think that's a a really cool idea. So, but I can't say any more on it than that, unfortunately. I don't know. There might be some people in the working group who have expertise on that, but I'm not sure.
Okay, so we just have time for one more, I think. Okay, so is there historical data and any indication of what percentage of oysters on the oyster grounds were alive? There's some debate regarding the carrying capacity of oysters in the North Sea, and they may have influenced these themselves, but there should be limits. So that's from Luca van der Ren.
Yeah, that's a good question, and unfortunately another one that I can't answer at the moment. I mean, we may find that sort of information. I do know that there were some later scientific surveys in places like Scotland where they did gather that information, but they were already highly impoverished oyster grounds, and in fact you could barely call them oyster grounds by that point. So it would be really fantastic to find that information. I'm not sure whether we will be able to find that, but we'll keep an eye out. It's a really important point. Thank you.
So I think we're now 3 minutes past, and we have to take a break at 5 minutes past. And I have a couple of things that I need to tell you before we do so. So I'd like to first of all thank our working group representatives there for their contributions there. That's fantastic. And also our keynote speakers earlier who did a fantastic job there as well. What we've got coming up now, I also have to thank you all for keeping to time. That's fantastic. We're bang on time. So I need to invite you to take a break shortly. But before I do, I'm just going to introduce our next chair. So our next chair is Karel, and he's from Ark Nature in the Netherlands. He manages shellfish reef restoration projects along the Dutch coast. He's just turned his camera on there so he can wave to you. There we go. And he will be taking over after this session. We will be inviting people to take a break, but you need to be back at 15 minutes past the hour.
Good morning everyone, I'm Matt Uttley, and today I'll give brief updates on our pilot results and scale-up plans on behalf of the Essex Native Oyster Restoration Initiative. If you have any questions from today, please feel free to drop me an email. It's matt@bluemarinefoundation.com. So we've been working in our restoration box in the Blackwater, as shown here in the top image. In 2019, we piloted different settlement treatments in the west of the box. This year, we've looked at biodiversity on these treatments. So today, I'll discuss these results as well as our settlement results and our plans for the future. Our biodiversity surveys were split into three main elements. The first element compared a new pre-treatment area with our 2019 treatments of Colch and Harrowing. This study compared species richness between the pre and post-treatment areas. The other two elements look solely within the 2019 treatment areas, one part looking at species richness and one part looking at abundance. So the first graph here shows pre and post restoration treatments. We found increased species richness in both treatments compared to the new pre-treated area, with the greatest species richness in the Colch treatment. Focusing solely on the 2019 experiment, again looking at species richness, we found that Colch had the greatest richness, but interestingly this time we found that Harrowing had a lower richness than the control. The final element of the biodiversity study looked at total abundance in the 2019 treatment plots. Both treatments saw a greater abundance than the control area. However, this difference we found was largely down to two predominant species, slipper limpet and barnacle. With these species removed, there was a similar total abundance across all treatments, despite differences in species richness. The other part of our monitoring looked at SPAC settlement. We compared settlement on different treatments and between 2019 and 2020. We saw similar results in both years, with the greatest settlement on Colch, some settlement on the control, and no settlement on the harrowed area. Interestingly, we saw a huge increase in the number of spat found in 2020 compared to 2019. To further examine settlement, we piloted the use of spat collectors. The first step was to ensure we timed deployment of the frames correctly. So we monitored adult spawning condition and deployed the frames in late June and mid-July. We saw very good settlement on both sets of frames, but the greatest settlement was found in the later July deployment. We then examined overwinter mortality across all frames and experienced an average spat mortality of 44.4%. The next step for us in 2020 is to look at settlement this year, and hopefully we'll see if this settlement on the frames mirrors the increased spat settlement we saw in the restoration treatments. So based on our pilot results, we plan to greatly increase culture deployment and so have purchased hundreds of tons of mulch. This is now weathering as per our biosecurity protocol and will be ready for deployment in 2021 and 2022. We're also running a larger harrowing trial as we think that the 2019 plots were too small to have any impact, and we also found sampling these small plots that we did last year proved quite difficult. So we have big plans for outreach over the next 2 years. We secured a grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund for trips for pupils with special educational needs and disabilities in order to provide access to nature and outdoor education to those who would not otherwise have the chance to experience it. We're also running local exhibitions, public events, and installing information boards, which is something I recently spoke about at the last NORA outreach meeting. So in summary, our biodiversity survey showed increased species richness and abundance on culch, and increased abundance on harrowed areas, but decreased species richness. We had good spat settlement on culch in 2019 and 2020, with increased settlement in 2020. Spat overwinter mortality was 44.4%. And finally, we have big plans to scale up restoration and outreach in 2021 and into the future. I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone who's made this work possible, and thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you, Matt, for that very interesting presentation. Especially your last point, the plans to scale up. I'm looking forward to hear about that next year. So, moving on to the next speaker. Again, a reminder to all participants, if you have questions for Matt, drop them in the box. In the meantime, our next speaker is Stéphane Pouvreau. He is working for Ifremer and is connected to the Forever Restoration Project in France. Stéphane, over to you.
Dear colleagues, first of all, many thanks to the NORA committee for giving me the opportunity to show you some first results concerning our project on flat oyster restoration in France, the so-called Forever Project. My presentation is entitled "The Devil is in the Detail" and deals with the Laval settlement preferences of Ostrioidulis and its implications for flat oyster restoration. So to begin, a few words about the Forever Project. Forever includes 5 main actions, one action at each important stage of the life cycle of Ostrioidulis. All actions have a common objective: provide scientific keys to conserve and restore the last flat oyster population in Brittany. The result I will show you today concern action 4 on the settlement stage. So first of all, you must know that the recruitment is a key process to maintain or restore a population of flat oyster, but it is important to say that to recruit, oyster needs substrates. Natural substrates are usually grains, but after 3 centuries of intense dredging, a large part of the substrates has been removed. An active restoration strategy consists of deploying new artificial substrates, and in the Forever Project, we have chosen to develop more specific concrete substrate. It is also important to know that larvae have preferences at settlement. They are indeed able to search actively the best place to fix. They are sensitive to several cues, especially to the surface characteristic of the substrates. So, of the present study was to test 10 substrates of the same composition, limestone concrete, but with different surface characteristics. This picture shows you the characteristic of the 10 substrates. It's number 1 to 5 have a very natural texture with increasing rugosity, whereas the other 5 substrates, number 6 to 10, have a more artificial, more geometric texture, but also with an increasing gradient of rugosity. So concerning the experiment, it took place as follows. The 10 substrates were tested in triplicate on 3 underwater frames, named A, B, C, according to a random distribution. The tests were carried out in the field, in the middle of a residual oyster bed in the Birch breast, at the peak of the reproduction in July, and substrates have been exposed to natural settlement for 2 weeks. At the end of the exposure period, samples were taken by diving, then examined and counted in the laboratory with the help of a 3D microscope. Statistical analyses were performed with air. So now the first result. On this figure, you can see the recruitment density we obtain on each sample in each frame. The color scale helps you to easily visualize the recruitment density from white for the lowest recruitment to red for the highest recruitment. Concerning the legend, on each little square, the first number corresponds to the type of substrates and the second number to the recruitment density per square centimeter. So just by looking at the color, you can easily see a strong difference in colonization between samples, even for those which are very close together. Note that there is sometimes a factor of 10 between adjacent samples. So first result to keep in mind, larvae do not settle randomly at all. They make a very choice at settlement. So now the second result of this study. This graph shows the distribution of the recruitment according to the type of substrate. The effect is very significant. Some substrates are very attractive, especially number 5, while other substrates have a very low values. So the second result to retain a major effect of the surface characteristics of the substrates. So to briefly sum up my presentation, first we have developed a very simple and robust method to test at-field larval settlement preferences. We have shown that substrates texture and rugosity have really an important effect on settlement. The best substrate is substrate number 6. Its surface looks like natural limestone. In fact, if we look on a lower scale, we can see that the larvae prefer to colonize hollows and holes. So microtopography seems to be an important factor to take into account during the design of artificial reefs. And to finish, we can say that some teeny details can be really decisive for the success of the restoration. Many thanks for your attention, and let's keep in touch. More results on Forever will coming soon.
Thank you, Stéphane. I'm really eager to start asking questions, but not possible at the moment. We have to keep moving. Like I said, this is moving along very fast. So we'll come to the questions after all the speakers in this session. So I'll move over to the next one, which is Tom Cameron. Tom is associated with the University of Essex and the same project as Matt Uttley was talking about, the ENORI, the Essex Native Oyster Restoration Initiative in the UK. Tom, the floor is yours.
Hello, I'm Tom Cameron from the University of Essex, and today I'm here to talk to you about active seabed management for native oyster restoration, specifically whether there's a case for harrowing. Harrowing is when we disturb the seabed using quite heavy gear, such as these chains here used in a Kent and Essex trial. Seabed of sediment to expose gravel and shell. This is to support recruitment of oysters so that there are bits of gravel and shell that spat can settle to. It's viewed as essential to mariculture success by oyster fishing communities, but it's also viewed as detrimental to the seabed, potentially for conservation objectives, and so it's quite a controversial activity. There have been several trials that have already looked at whether or not harrowing does influence oyster spat settlement. The evidence is mixed, even though it's general that many oystering areas can be shell and gravel and substrate limited. Even early studies that looked at extensive harrowing found limited success. And there have been several recent trials on Essex. One's just started and one was completed in 2015 in different types of habitats that found that there could be long-lasting effects on the seabed of harrowing, where to 7 months later, but there was no real change in the sediment type and no clear evidence of success. Harrowing trials conducted by the scientific community, by the fishing community, that said that we're not often using the methods that they actually use themselves. But if you look at the Bromley study, which is much more closely aligned to the industrial activities, that also found relatively limited success. Today I'm here to present an opportunity that I got to work with Tollesbury and Mersey Oyster Company, undertaking their 2018 stock survey, where we did a dredge survey of 159 4-hectare boxes in the Blackwater estuary. We sampled over 3,000 native oysters in this survey, and we were able to size each one. This is what we surveyed. This is the area that they work in. And if you notice the no tweet sign, if you see that, please don't put this information on social media. So we have the unique data set with the location, the density, and the size of native oysters in 2018. The oysters that are 35 to 59 millimeters in size are recruits, and those that are 60 millimeters and larger are adults. What's the unique thing is we have the harrowing and cleaning and dredging effort in each of these boxes in each of 2016, 17, and 18. So we're able to link effort to recruitment. Skipping straight to the result, does more cleaning effort lead to more recruitment? We've had to take account of the spatial autocorrelation that you get in this data. Because of course, where you find more adult oysters, we expect to find more juveniles. But even when we take account of that using an appropriate mixed effects model and appropriate data distributions, we find very strong effects of cleaning effort with increased recruitment at 3- and 4-year-old oysters. But it's not just as simple as that. There's a switch. So at a certain point, once you've got enough adult oysters on the site, any further cleaning either has no effect or eventually could become detrimental. So positive effects of cleaning do occur in this highly sedimented system at low to moderate depths. So this tells us a number of different things. We have mimicked, in fact, used data from the industry. So industry trials must use industry methods. Essex is a very highly sedimented estuary and many slipper limpets. So maybe our results are unique to this system. But we'd urge, again, to think about using industry methods. Also think about regular spatfall and interannual variation. Some of our years didn't have the spatfall, and so the 3-year study was important. So is restoration mariculture? And is mariculture a potential restoration? It would appear that yes, if you have low numbers of oysters or none, using harrowing might be a way to get started. But once you have lots of oysters, continuing harrowing might be a detrimental activity. Questions remain for other biological and conservation objectives, but at the moment it would appear that active intervention to increase recruitment does work. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Emilie Reuchlin, and I will be presenting to you the Dutch Shellfish Reef Restoration Field Project on behalf of all these amazing people in the Netherlands that we work with. It'll be a good challenge to present to you 5 field locations in 5 minutes. So on we go. First of all, we have a oyster reef placed in a wind park, a large one called the Borkum Stones, where we placed 5,500 kilos, and also an oyster reef on a wreck with a smaller amount of oysters from Norway. Then in the south, in the Four Delta area, we have 2 locations where we're trying to kickstart reef, expand one, strengthen one, working with spat on shell. And we have a couple of exciting results to share with you. In the north, in the wind park, Gemini, we observed larvae in the water column both last year and this year. This also goes for the Borkum Stones. And in addition, this area where we just came back from monitoring a couple of weeks ago, again, recruitment, settlement, we released some spat and saw survival and growth of that spat. The reef, it's really starting to begin to function like a reef. We also placed some 3D printed sandstone reef structures, which are doing quite well for biodiversity. And the oyster reef on a wreck is doing really well, where we're working with a local dive team, Oyster, who are doing citizen science and observing survival and growth the last year. For the oyster larval count, something really exciting happened, because we saw the most larvae in between the two sites of Gemini and Borkum stones. For the Borkum stones, this is a picture of a few weeks ago. We have observed recruits in research cages on the seabed, growing quite well. Some spet that we had from a hatchery, we observed alive. And in this year, also again, spet in a research case, we have some amazing videos that appeared on the news. So I hope you can have some time after this to watch those. Here, the 3D printed sandstone reef structures that we placed, they were quite bold going in, and so were the oysters. Then after 1 year, this is what it looked like. And this a few weeks ago, we're seeing lots of amazing species on the reef. The oysters acting as a reef, the 3D printed structures acting as a reef. We're seeing species here that we haven't seen here before, so that's going really well. And on the wreck, survival and growth, with also some mortality of the oysters on the seabed. So having to look further into that. And the oysters here also working as substrate for different species, like this plumose anemone here. And also a really great video of how we placed the reef. In the Fort Delta area down south, we're working, and this is ARC doing most of the work here. Bolle van de Ooster, where we're trying to kickstart an oyster reef in the Fort Delta area. We were working with a pretty bad batch, so the survival is not great, the growth is not great, and also the location there has some suboptimal conditions. It's also very difficult to monitor there. Anyway, this is teaching us a lot, and we have to reconsider what we're going to do with this project. And the Brouwersdam, we have an existing mixed shellfish reef here that we're trying to protect and strengthen and expand. The spet release research is going really well. Here you see Karel with the chains that we made of spet on shell. Amazing growth, amazing survival, and something interesting to mention here is that obviously the growth was higher at a lower spet density per shell. And this monitoring is also ongoing. And here are some of the specific details of the growth and survival. And here's some pictures at deployment, after checkup, and again after 4 months. And another exciting project on land actually is a shell recycling program, where we're collecting the shells after consumption, and then we use them as substrate, as spet on shell, expanding the reefs, all that kind of thing. We have over 30 cubic meters collected. We haven't started a long time ago, so early stages, few partners, but hoping to expand very soon. And our conclusions from the field, marine biodiversity being restored, working with mature native oysters and spet on shell in near and offshore areas is showing really promising results. The hatchery production is ongoing, varying success there. We have the 3D printed reefs that are really helping to kickstart those reef functions. And yeah, basically we're ready to scale up. Only we need the protected status of the flat oyster and space for restoration of the reefs. And also we need to tackle those issues in the hatcheries to really create volumes to scale up our oyster restoration projects. And yeah, please check out our reports as well. And I would like to thank you for your attention and look forward to all the other talks and good discussion. All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Emilie. Well, as everybody could see, I'm involved myself in this project, but even for me, this was very, very fast. I would just like to repeat what was said at the beginning of the conference, that this whole thing is being recorded, and afterwards all participants will receive a link to YouTube to rewatch if you want to. Over to already the final speaker of this session. I would like to introduce Verena Merk. She works for the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany. She will be, as I said, the final speaker, and then we will have 10 minutes for a Q&A with all the speakers. Verena, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone, we are all excited to share the latest development of oyster restoration in Germany with you today. As most of you will remember, there used to be extensive oyster beds far off the German coast. Project Restore aims at reintroducing those offshore oysters. During Restore 1, we have successfully proven that the environmental conditions are still favorable for a return of the native oysters. But fieldwork was done in cages and did, for example, not include the factors predation and sedimentation. With Restore 2, we will upscale our experiments by setting up a pilot reef for oyster restoration. Following specific site selection criteria, we decided on a suitable site in the marine protected area Borkum Reef Ground. This site is now a designated research area where fishery is completely excluded. This summer, we successfully deployed and kick-started the pilot reef to explore the technical feasibility of offshore restoration, which takes place in a water depth of around 30 meters. For setting up the reef base and deploying the oysters, we worked with 4 different vessels and different dive teams in the area. In the following movie, we will share with you some details and some scenes of our work.
Am Standort des Alfred-Wegener-Instituts auf Helgoland entsteht eine Aufzuchtanlage für die im Bestand bedrohte heimische europäische Auster. Für die Wiederansiedlung in der Nordsee werden die Austern hier im Projekt Proceed gezüchtet und wachsen zu gesunden Jungtieren heran. Die Bedingungen für die Wiederansiedlungsmaßnahmen sowie geeignete Standorte in der deutschen Bucht werden bereits seit 2016 im Projekt Restore untersucht. Im Restore-Hauptvorhaben wird nun ein Pilotausternriff im Naturschutzgebiet Borkum Riffgrund errichtet. Die sogenannten Saataustern werden hier dafür vorbereitet und auf das Schiff verladen. Das Ziel der Fahrt liegt nördlich der Insel Borkum und rund 80 Seemeilen von Helgoland entfernt. Historisch war die europäische Auster hier in großen Beständen zu finden, bevor sie kontinuierlich überfischt wurde und so seit etwa 100 Jahren in der deutschen Nordsee als ausgestorben gilt. In einem der 3 ausgewiesenen Natura 2000 Schutzgebiete der deutschen Nordsee wird in 30 Meter Wassertiefe ein erstes, etwa 200 Quadratmeter großes Versuchsfeld entstehen. Bevor die Austern allerdings in ihrer neuen Heimat ankommen können, wird zunächst eine Steinunterlage an der Position des zukünftigen Pilotriffs ausgebracht.
Die Steinunterlage ist hier vorbereitet. Das sind Kalksteine, die da ausgebracht werden, sodass wir einen flachen Steinuntergrund haben, auf dem dann die Austern nach und nach angesiedelt werden können.
Denn der Nordseeboden sieht heute anders aus. Es gibt keine Austernriffflächen mehr und der lockere Sandboden am Standort könnte die Austern sonst leicht überlagern. Nun können die für diesen Zweck gezüchteten Austern ebenfalls in die Tiefe transportiert werden.
Im ersten Schritt werden wir jetzt eine Riffstruktur ausbringen, an der schon Austern angesiedelt sind. Und danach kommen auf die Steinschüttungen dann zusätzlich noch lebende Austern, die teils auf Schalen angesiedelt sind, also auf leeren Austernschalen, und teils wirklich ganz junge, kleine Austern, die wir jetzt einfach dort aussetzen.
Im ersten Schritt werden so etwa 100.000 Saataustern als Grundstein für das Pilotriff ausgebracht. Austern bilden eine dreidimensionale Struktur und damit einen wertvollen Lebensraum auch für andere Lebewesen. Die Wiederansiedlung der europäischen Auster dient also nicht nur dem Artenschutz einer Art, sondern trägt als Maßnahme des Meeresnaturschutzes auch dazu bei, die Artenvielfalt insgesamt zu erhöhen. Die Wissenschaftler werden in den kommenden Jahren das Austernriff regelmäßig untersuchen.
Probennahme erfolgt dann einmal im Jahr, sodass wir immer in den Sommermonaten Wachstum und Gesundheit der Austern untersuchen können, aber auch die Biodiversität am Riff, also alle Arten, die sich dann auf der Austernbank wieder ansiedeln oder wieder ansässig werden, werden dann bei unseren Untersuchungen erfasst.
Diese Erkenntnisse unterstützen die Entwicklung und Umsetzung großflächiger Wiederansiedlungsmaßnahmen in der deutschen Nordsee.
Verena, I'm doubting now whether you will say any final words, but guessing from the end of the video, I'll just pick up from there. So we now have 10 minutes for questions. I have been trying to keep an eye on the Q&A box. It seems to me that there are less votes than in the other sessions. So just as a reminder, if you read a question from somebody else and you think it's really important that you like to get it answered, just press the little thumbs up icon and it will move to the top of the list. Okay, first question is a question for Stéphane. Stéphane, are you going to use these findings to develop more artificial structures?
Yes, of course. Yes, we have already built a reef, a kind of reef. I can show you that in the next presentation. And yes, of course, you will use this material, the shell concrete, with this surface characteristic, and of course, yeah, it is planned.
Thank you. Actually, you get a couple of questions, it seems to me, Stéphane, so stick close to the microphone. Another one, did you notice much settlement on the underside of the settlement plates? It's a question by Luke Helmer.
Look, in fact, the underside of all the plate are very flat. There are no differences between the underside. Okay. The texture, the surface characteristic was only on the upper side. Yeah? So all the plates have the same underside. So we have no difference. And furthermore, they are very flat. So yes, the settlement was low on the side. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. A question from Joanne, from Joe Preston, for Tom. How do you resolve the impacts of harrowing on biodiversity, even if it can improve recruitment of an impacted bed?
That's one of those unanswered questions, the cost that we haven't necessarily got the data. But I mean, obviously harrowing is intensive, but it actually is a very short-term activity. It's a couple of days work per year. And so it actually it's not a lot of pressure all year round, and estuaries biodiversity is very seasonal. I'd also add, there's actually no evidence at the moment that we have a significant decline in biodiversity on harrowed areas. We might say the mean changes a little bit, but there's no evidence that the biodiversity or the species richness declines. And in fact, work we've done on that several order finds that its maximum species richness, where we get most oysters, is the same as the protected areas where you have similar oyster densities. So all I would say is that, if harrowing results in more oysters and more reef-like habitat for a period of time, you then expect more biodiversity on those sites. So it's not a given, and there's some spatial and temporal considerations to take into account that it will result in less biodiversity.
Thank you. Emilie, a question for you from Tom van der Haven. Can the oyster larvae at the site without introduced oysters originate from natural oysters still remaining in the North Sea? Did you perform any genetic tests on the sampled larvae?
Thank you, that's a very good question. We haven't done any genetic tests. This information we haven't had this for a very long time. For sure, it's a possibility. We do not know where those larvae came from. So that's a very good suggestion that we can look into. I'm equally as curious as you, Tom. So yeah, we need to figure this out.
Yeah, and just to add, and this goes probably for all projects, we are of course budget limited. So we cannot answer all the questions that we can think of, but this is a good one. Stéphane, back to you again. Are you planning on doing the same research? Did I ask this one already? I'm unsure now, but please remind me if I did. Are you planning on doing the same research with other substrate types? I think I asked this one. Eh?
More or less. In fact, yeah, we have already a publication in the special issue of Aquatic Conservation with Béranger, Colsoul and Bernadette, where we test several kind of material. So yeah, at the moment we are trying to, we are currently testing concrete and shell concrete especially, but yes, we can also test other material if necessary, of course.
And let's make a connection with the next question, which is not specifically to you, Stéphane, but I was thinking about it. Did you see any change or difference between settlement of other oyster species? Like, were you sure you had only flat oyster settlement, or were there other species as well?
In fact, we can have settlement of Pacific oyster, for example, but where we test all the substrates, it is in the middle of residual bed, flat oyster bed, and it is not on the. It is more or less deep, 5 meters deep, and there is no, more or less no Pacific oyster recruitment on this site. Sometimes, of course, depending on the site, we can have a mix between flat oyster and Pacific oyster, of course. Yeah, and we can also note that we have also, for example, I don't know if you know it, but the black scallop. We can have settlement of black scallop on our collector too, and also many other species.
Right. To broaden this up a little bit, also to the other speakers, if anyone would like to react on this question, were there any interactions, either positive or negative, noted with Pacific oysters in all the projects? Does anyone want to react to that?
We did get Pacific oysters on our SPAC collectors. We're not quite 100% sure on the ratio yet. But we didn't find, well, we found one or two, but virtually no mature Pacific oysters in any of our biodiversity surveys. So we're seeing the spat and the larvae in our restoration area, but not the adult oysters.
And can anyone give an example of a positive interaction?
Yeah, in our research in the south of the Netherlands, where we found a mixed shellfish reef of about 40 hectares, we have a mixture of Japanese flat oyster and mussels, and we published research on this and found that actually it might be the case that the Japanese oyster is facilitating the flat oyster. So there could be a positive interaction there as well. It's a paper that I can post a link somewhere perhaps, but definitely that's something we're seeing there. The offshore areas, we're not sure yet. We haven't really looked. I mean, the monitoring with professional divers is often limited to 1 or 2 days per year because it's so expensive. So it's hard to say what we find there yet, conclusively.
From our offshore experience we didn't have any negative interaction with the Pacific oyster specifically. So to add on that.
Thank you. Looking at the time, it seems we have to move on. There are still a list of questions that haven't been answered yet, but they will be shared with you and the speakers will have the opportunity to answer them after this session, or even after this whole conference. So thank you to all speakers. This wraps up the session on existing projects and their results. And we will move to the next part of this conference. And we are actually coming to a few specific presentations, announcements, and calls. You will get the information, the details about it with every speaker who will introduce what they will be talking about. The next speaker, I would like to announce Bernadette Pogoda. I guess an introduction is almost not necessary anymore. But just to repeat, Bernadette works for the Alfred Wegener Institute, and she also leads 2 of the German restoration projects under the titles Proceed and Restore, and she is a member of the NORA Advisory Board. Bernadette, over to you.
Dear NORA colleagues, I would now like to take you on a quick informative tour through the Ospar Status Assessment for Austria Aegialis and Austria Aegialis beds. All assessments are part of JAMP, the Joint Assessment and Monitoring Program, and will contribute to the Quality Status Report in 2023. Against this background, ICG POSH asked the Netherlands and Germany to prepare this assessment for the European oyster. A joint collaboration was established between AVI and Wageningen Marine Research, and I thank Oscar Bos, Jacqueline Tamis, Chris Gross, and a number of European experts in the field for their great work. In general, the information generated through the status assessment process will explore if existing measures are effective and sufficient, and will inform OSPA's future decision-making. This can be done either by assessing the status of a feature or through a proxy approach by assessing changes in human activities and pressures. And as you can see on the right side, this information will then all be summarized into an OSPAR spreadsheet document. The relevant period to be assessed would be from when the latest status assessment was completed. And Austria Aegialis was added to the OSPAR list in 2003, considering its decline and sensitivity. And the background document of 2009 is, so to say, defined as the last status assessment and reported no changes in the evaluation against the Texel-Fayal selection criteria. As key resources for preparing the assessment, we use this background document, the OSPAR list, the OSPAR recommendation, and expert judgments via, for example, scientific papers, grey literature, interviews, and so on. The assessment criteria refer back to the background document, and therefore we assess trends in distribution, in population size and abundance, in condition, key pressures, and effectiveness of management. For Austria Aegialis, we do this in the OSPAR regions 2, 3, and 4, as you can see them here on the map. As an example, please have a look at the assessment of threats which focus on those described as high in the background document. Ideally, this is done quantitatively or semi-quantitatively, but as data is not available for all activities or for all OSPAR regions, also qualitative assessments can be made. In the table to the right, you can see the relevant OSPAR regions, relevant for Austria Aegialis, and the relevant key pressures we have identified. For each pressure and region, the evidence is then in the next step defined as either reducing, increasing, or as not changing, and the types of data, information, sources which were used to define that evidence are listed. And this is the numeration you can see. This process then allows an overall estimation of the status of pressures and threats. And as you can see, green cells mean no evidence of significant impact. Red cells do show significant threats or impacts. And for a number of blue cells, we identified that there is not enough data available. This is done for all listed criteria and included into the assessment sheet, where all information is summarized in only 2 pages. Very challenging, I can tell you. But additionally, there is the audit trail section. And the audit trail and annex capture all additional evidence and information to document the assessment process, the sources of information, and any decisions made to, for example, include or exclude data. This audit trail section is not subject to a word limit and therefore can provide full references, additional maps, and all information we have. This section will not be published with the assessment document, but it will be made available for Ospar users behind a password. And now here's my invitation for you to participate. The status as of now is we have identified and analyzed the relevant documents for the preparation of the assessment. Via the NORA network, we have identified and contacted national experts of Ospar member states and have so far received feedback and information from most of them. And based on this, we have now compiled a draft version, which is currently being revised by the POSH group. And we also invite you to provide further input and comments. So please contact me if you're interested and if you can provide any relevant or new information for your specific region, or if you have related questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bernadette, for that. Bernadette already ended with an invitation to react. Just again, I would like to remind you, you can also do that right now by using the Q&A box. Just as a reminder, we will not have a verbal Q&A anymore, but the box will be available until the very end of this online conference. The next speaker, I guess there is no need to introduce him anymore, Bill Sanderson. But just as a quick note, Bill, of course, was the host of NORA 2 last year. And thinking back on that conference, I have fond memories of the opening reception. But on a more serious note, I guess we're all really missing the surge of energy you get from really getting together. And just let's keep our fingers crossed we'll get that opportunity again in 2021. Moving on, Bill, the floor is yours.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the output from the NORA 2 scientific presentations in Edinburgh. So we've now produced this as a special issue of Aquatic Conservation, Marine and Freshwater Ecosystems. And these were my collaborators during the conference that helped to host this. So collaborators within the DEEP project, the Dornoch Environmental Enhancement Project. So that's Glenmorangie, Single Malt Scottish Whisky, Heriot-Watt University, the Marine Conservation Society, and we had additional funding from Scottish Natural Heritage and Scottish Enterprise. Excuse me. So the conference was titled Unlocking the Blueprint for Native Oyster Restoration in Europe. It was the second international conference of NORA in May 2019. And this, of course, is significant in Edinburgh because this was the city in the 1800s that exported up to 30 million oysters a year for over a decade across the UK and across the North Sea to Dutch, French, and other countries. The conference itself was held in the prestigious Royal Society in Edinburgh and was opened by our minister and also supported by DEEP partners and also by the International Research Advisory Panel for the DEEP project who are shown here. And I should mention that, of course, this builds on the extremely successful Berlin conference, which had been held previously and was 68 people. And this conference was twice the size. Okay, so here we are all together in a time when it was okay to be this close to each other. 155 people came from 15 different countries, and all the major European Northeast Atlantic countries in particular were present. So a great event, and this was the evening reception that Carol was just referring to. And of course, none of this would be possible without the scientific committee and chairs that vigorously supported this event. So Pierre Boudry, Alison Devney, Bernadette Pogoda, Bose Hancock, Pauline Kammermans, Stéphane Pouvreau, Joanne Preston, and Feline Zuemgersen, people who are very familiar to you from the last couple of days. And this is the special issue as it will appear on the 12th of November. So this is volume 30, number 11. It has 13 papers in it, so that's, I guess, lucky 13. And I started to reflect on this when I was putting this presentation together. And of course, this is the largest contemporary collection of native European oyster restoration science this century. I'm sure it'll be aced further down the line, but it's a real go-to publication now. And an essential Christmas gift for all you oyster restorers around the world. I can't wait that long, of course. I'm going to have to get hold of my copy next week when it becomes available. And none of this is possible, of course, without the sterling support of Professor John Baxter, seen here at the bottom, who is the editor for this volume and a staunch supporter of nature conservation and, of course, oyster restoration. And I hope the authors will forgive me for dramatically abridging the titles of their papers here to try and give you a flavour of what's inside. So this is my sneaky peek. Bernadette has led a paper on NORA and the development of the NORA community and the principles there. Feline Zuemgersen has led a really interesting paper on the 40 major questions that need to be answered in order to unlock native oyster restoration, and led another paper with several other authors on the benefits of bivalve restoration around the world. So the ecosystem service evidence that we know of for the bivalve species that are the subject of restoration. We have a fantastic paper from the Zoological Society of London on the impact of impact investment, how to actually fund research based on work that the ZSL have done on rhinos and other species. We have some of the first evidence of blue carbon and oysters from Hannah Lee et al. And also Van der Brink et al. Have produced a paper on optimizing spat collectors. And as we heard earlier, we've also got another paper on nature-based substrates for hatcheries and recruitment from Coulson et al. We have more information on larval behavior from Ana Rodriguez and her co-authors. And Joanne Preston has produced a paper on oysters, biodiversity, and the invasive non-native species Crepidula. Hein Sas has produced a paper on bonamia and restoration with his co-authors, and Bernadette Pogoda has a paper in here on offshore site selection. Merk et al. Have a paper on survival, growth, and condition that we've heard glimpses of just now, and also there's a paper on an integral production model by Laun et al. So 13 fantastic papers in aquatic conservation, and this will all become available live online next week. So without any more ceremony, I will just leave you with the cover picture and say I hope you enjoy this milestone volume. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. That's wonderful. And I'm sure everybody's putting it on their wish list now for Christmas. That is amazing. And with that, we'll move to our next speaker, which is Feline Zuemgersen. I have all these names and people that don't need a real introduction, I guess. They're famous in the NORA network. But Feline, of course, is the NORA Secretariat in person, I can almost say. And she will bring us some further exciting news from the network. Feline, please.
Thank you, Carl. I'm here today, I've got 10 minutes, and this presentation arose because it occurred to me that it was announced at NORA 2 that the Nature Conservancy and myself would be becoming the NORA Secretariat for 2 years. but that since then, many of you may not have known what we were up to and who we are. So I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce the full Secretariat. Bose Hancock leads the show. Catherine Volny-Gurke, you have all heard from over the past weeks, as she is our logistical genius and has been managing the registrations and information for our conferences. And Andreas Essenberger, you won't have heard from, but he is singularly responsible for the many, many updates and upgrades that we, the Secretariat, have made to the NORA website over the past 17 months that we've been working on it. So I just want to acknowledge their role. This presentation is the result of all of our efforts. The first job of the Secretariat was to establish an advisory board. And again, you have not had the opportunity to e-meet these specifically as a group, although many of them will be familiar to you now from the conference. These 10 experts have volunteered their time to provide the NORA Secretariat with steering on what we can best do to serve the needs of the NORA community. I would urge you, if you would like to reach out to any of the NORA Advisory Board and give them your opinions and thoughts as to the NORA network. It's always great. Our meetings are always very engaging and they have fantastic ideas and they're already very well connected, but they have also stressed that they enjoy hearing from people within the network. You've heard over the last 2 mornings about a lot of work that the Secretariat has supported, sometimes in collaboration or often in collaboration with the Native Oyster Network UK and Ireland. But aside from these fantastic glossy, in fact, first I want to say, in this special issue of the Aquatic Conservation that is coming out on the 12th, which we're very excited about, it represents work from across the NORA community, as Bill has already said. But there are also papers in it that are specifically the result of NORA collaborations, this open calls for information, groups within NORA getting together. And I just wanted to highlight that it's really fantastic to see the network itself with its members producing these joint collaborative outputs. But we're not just about the glory of glossy covers. There's a lot of work going on within the network, within the Secretariat, to keep our Twitter page, our Twitter feed, interesting with information for those who enjoy learning more about oyster restoration in Europe. The Twitter feed is primarily used to share information from outside the network that might be relevant, as well as to promote information from within the network. So for example, on the left here, you can see an announcement following Matt Uttley's talk recently at the NORA Outreach Working Group. We've also announced, for example, the fantastic blog written by Karen Didderen and colleagues on the biodiversity that you can find on oyster reefs that they've been doing research on in the Netherlands. So if you are interested in receiving such news, please do follow us on Twitter. We hope that you find it engaging, and we're always willing to hear feedback and get information from you that you would like to share with the network. It's not just Twitter though, as I've already alluded to. Andreas has been very busy with the website, keeping it up to date with information that is of relevance to everybody. All of the kind of working group presentations, all of the meetings that have been mentioned at this conference, Andreas has been busy uploading the information for onto our website. So please do go and have a look and have a read and get in contact with the contacts that are listed on the website after the conference. This is the point of the website. We would love people to visit it to find out more. But don't just stop by reading our recent posts about the meetings. Do have a scroll through and look at some of the other fantastic posts we've organized with the network community over the past 18 months. We have, for example, had guest posts from James Weaver, who's an artist on Mersey Island in Essex, talking about his experience with the native oyster and why he enjoys painting it. And it's got some fantastic illustrations alongside, so that's extremely engaging read. We, for example, have also had a guest post from Hannah Lee and Bill Sanderson highlighting in more accessible terms to the general public, perhaps, than a scientific paper, the current understanding about oyster reefs in Europe as a carbon source or sink. So please do go and have a look. We've also been organising meetings, and this is the point at which I really want to stress that we at the Secretariat are extremely grateful to Joe Preston and Alison Debney, who head up the Native Oyster Network UK and Ireland, for being so receptive to partnering and joining resources to create outputs and meetings that we think are significantly improved by having both partners involved. Certainly the outputs we've produced are completely underpinned by the work that Celine Gamble and the rest of the Native Oyster Network team have been providing to us. So a special thanks goes to Celine Gamble for the fantastic effort she has put into organising logistics for meetings and working with designers and editing our recent joint publications. We're extremely pleased to have this collaboration. And we don't want to leave it with all of the exciting product launches being yesterday. We want to offer you something more today. Please come back again next time and hopefully we'll have even more for you. But if you have a look now at our website, in our resources section, the Native Oyster Network UK and Ireland and NORA are extremely pleased to be sharing with you all of the infographics and line drawings that you hopefully find extremely appealing from our recent guidance documents. And you can download them there and use them freely as long as they are acknowledged. So please do go and have a look. Frankly, since I had them, it was very difficult for me not to just fill the entire presentation with these beautiful drawings. So thanks goes to the designer as well for their fantastic efforts. Please do go and have a look. But one launch is not enough. Please go back to our website again if you've already left it and explore, please, our NORA expert database. This is something that the advisory board and the Secretariat identified early on as being of interest to the NORA community. We get a lot of requests through, a lot of people wanting more information about, for example, oyster supply in particular, or oyster demand. We are offering this expert database as a solution to some of those queries. At the moment, we need experts to populate this database. So if you could visit the website, if you feel like you know anything about native oyster restoration that you would like to share with the general community, then please do go, fill in your details, identify yourself as one of the areas of expertise. And then at a later date, hopefully, we'll be able to see many more experts crop up in our search terms on this database. So thank you to our testers, a few of who are displayed here, who've been ensuring that what goes live today is hopefully an extremely useful product. So I really do urge you to go register, send it to your oyster producer friends, as we'd also love to get more industry involvement. There's a lot of expertise out there and a lot of projects seeking oyster stock and expertise. So it would be fantastic if we could see real growth in this network over the coming days, in this database over the coming days. And just to wrap up, I would like to say we are extremely interested in hearing from you. I've just set up a poll. This poll is just about the NORA conference and what you've enjoyed about it today. We would love to hear about your thoughts. It's very quick and easy to fill in. There's just 7 questions with clickable answers. It's possible, possibly even likely, that we may meet online again, and it would be great to have your thoughts as to how you found it today and what you'd like to hear more of, so we can tailor future events to your needs. Outside of this poll, please do reach out to the Secretariat or to the Advisory Board with information you would like to share through the network, if you're interested in writing a blog post. If you have an opinion on what NORA should be looking to do next. We are thinking about the next phase of NORA, and we're really interested in hearing your thoughts. So please don't hold back. We now open up the chat box to all attendees, as well as panelists, to please share any thoughts they have between now and 10 minutes after the end of the conference on what you like about NORA, what you don't like about NORA, and where you would like to see NORA go next. We'll also leave the poll running for about another 5 minutes. It is very quick to complete though, so please do have a look at it and give us your thoughts. My biggest thanks goes to the NORA community for making the network what it is. It's fantastic to have the opportunity to work with such engaged, knowledgeable, and energetically positive people. So thank you very much. And with that, I hand back to the next speakers, who are a series on calls for collaborations. This is what NORA is all about. Thank you, Åsa.
Thank you, Philin. If there's any new attendees to this conference, my name is Åsa Strand and I work as a researcher at IVL, Swedish Environmental Research Institute. I'm just going to see if I have activated the slide here. Yes. So this is a call for collaboration related to automated sorting of oyster seed by species. To provide you with a brief background related to this question, the challenge for the Swedish oyster industry and for our restoration projects is that we are dependent on capture of wild oyster seed to perform our activities. But since the Pacific oyster established in 2006, we now get both Pacific oysters and flat oysters on our sea-based seed collectors. But we are not allowed to culture the Pacific oyster due to its status as invasive. So what happens is that we end up doing this manual sorting to separate the two oyster species and any other species from the collectors, which is obviously very time-consuming and labor-demanding. So we started thinking about different solutions related to this and discussed with some colleagues working with image analysis and machine learning if we could develop a solution related to automated sorting of the seed. And we had a database with over 1,000 pictures of flat oyster and Pacific oyster seed. I'm not going to go into the details related to this database due to time constrictions. But we used these images in a neural network process and combined this with machine learning and trained this network using a subset of the pictures. And we used one subset for validation of the software. And as you can see on this figure, we had great success with this little pilot trial. We classified the pictures, 98% of them were classified correctly as either flat oysters or Pacific oysters. So now we want to move this forward. And as you know, when you use sea-based seed collectors, you will not only get the oyster seed, but you will have lime residues, you will get other species on your collectors. So in the future project that we want to initiate now is use pictures of smaller seed with lime residues, pictures from the front and the back of the seed, as the back will be covered in lime, and use a more thorough classification method to separate all of this. We also want to make contact with companies to see if there's any interest from them to develop a physical sorting machine. So what we ask of you is statements if this is of any interest to you. Are you experiencing the same issues that we have with settlement of two different species? Do you need to separate them? Could this be a potential solution for acquiring local sources of seed? Also, if you have any pictures that we could have access to, because the trials we are doing is on pilot scale and we don't have pictures of commercial scale harvest of collectors. So at this point, we don't really know what product the machine and the software needs to process. How much debris is left mixed with the seeds? What do the seed looks like after harvest? We do have our pilot pictures, but from a commercial perspective. So if you find this interesting, if you have any questions or have any information you can provide to us, please let us know, and you can see my email address at the end of this slide. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Karel. I splitted my presentation in 2 different calls, so don't be confused if this says call for collaboration 1. Yeah, dear NORA colleagues, many of you might be aware that 2 fantastic funding opportunities, 2 for the NORA initiative highly interesting calls are currently open. So I would like to discuss those with you or raise your attention to them. The first one is within the biodiversa frame. It's called Conservation and Restoration of Degraded Ecosystems and Their Biodiversity, including a focus on aquatic systems. And the second one is within the Horizon 2020 European Green Deal call in Area 7, where we have topic 7.1, Restoring Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Next slide, please. Thank you. So both calls are referring to the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and both calls are contributing to the implementation of the biodiversity strategy. Next slide, please. So the biodiversa call is covering 3 topics, and the first one is addressing biological interactions for conservation and restoration. The second one is, if I read it correctly, more addressing an intensive knowledge transfer for different target groups, including policy makers. And the third topic is really addressing upscaling of conservation and restoration actions. Next slide, please. So we are currently discussing a NORA proposal by addressing specific knowledge gaps of the 40 questions paper. We just heard about also by Bill when introducing the special issue. So in this paper, we have identified the most relevant questions for restoration. And we suggest to focus on one of those questions. So the challenging formal issue is that, as you can see on the slide, the deadline for pre-proposals is already the 6th of December. But the good thing is the pre-proposals only is around 5 pages. So this is something as we think we could do within the NORA community. So if you're interested, please contact us. Next slide, please. And the Green Deal call, Restoring Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, is clearly addressing the upscale of restoration projects within Europe. Next slide, please. And also includes in another area a citizen science part and a knowledge transfer part, which could also be interesting from the NORA perspective. Next slide, please. And the Green Deal call is clearly aiming under this area to restore biodiversity and ecosystem services. Particular emphasis is put on upscaling. And as you can see, large-scale restoration of degraded ecosystems and deployment of nature-based solutions are in the focus of this call. And there, the deadline is also approaching fast. It's already in January 2021, and it's the deadline for the full proposal. So from the NORA perspective, we discussed this, and we suggest that it's probably rather doable to identify existing consortia and see if we can hop on, or if there are some research questions important for NORA that can be included here, rather than suggesting an own proposal, but also this can obviously be discussed. Next slide, please. So here is our invitation to participate. The status as of now is that we will have an upcoming meeting within the NORA and non-network to discuss the biodiversa proposal. So please get in touch if you want to be included in this discussion. And the next thing is really a pending identification of existing Green Deal consortia. So please also be in touch if you are interested, or if you have any information related to existing consortia. Okay, so that was the call for collaboration part 1. Thank you. And with the next slide, I would like to come to the second call for collaboration from my side. And as you can see in the red box on the right side, this clearly has the status of idea, or maybe also crazy idea. So what's behind is that we are thinking about, in the context of site selection, to establish a habitat suitability online tool. And as we have already learned today from the fantastic talks, habitat suitability depends on site selection criteria and also on expert judgments if we do the habitat suitability model, for example. And you can see an example of different site selection criteria on the right side in that table. And for these selection criteria, you then need experts to do a sort of a weighing of these different criteria, which criteria are more important than others, for example, in different regions. So this can then be automated. Next slide, please. And the idea is to provide a wide range of site selection criteria. This will also follow up on the work Anne and Feline presented today, and also to provide NORA experts via this online tool and to facilitate the generation of regional habitat suitability maps. So what we have learned is that the IT behind an online tool in that topic is very challenging, but we also discussed that it's worth trying. And we could then ideally end up with regional suitability maps, or at least with facilitating or providing the knowledge for people of how to do it in their specific region. Next slide, please. So we will share further information on that work via the site selection working group. Or ask you to please contact us if you want to contribute with your expertise or as an expert. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette. Moving on to the final call for collaboration, which comes from Christiaan van Sluis. Christiaan is connected to the Dutch, the Rich North Sea program, and he will be joining us now. So, Christiaan, over to you.
Hi all, good afternoon. I'm Christiaan van Sluis. I'm a marine biologist working on the Rich North Sea program. And here I will present a call for collaboration and provide you a short overview of our work and of our goals and what we are doing. So the Rich North Sea program has been set up to take all the chances that arise in the outroll of offshore wind. And we know that there are also risks, but this program has been designed to make the most out of the opportunities of offshore wind. So our main aim is that offshore wind farms support a rich North Sea and a rich North Sea life. The project is now up and running for 1.5 years. We have been installing reefs, we have been monitoring, we have been testing, designing, and also scanning the North Sea bottom in future offshore wind farms for the existence of natural reefs in those areas. So these are just snapshots out of our program. This is a full overview, schematic overview of what we are doing. We've got 3 main pillars, but I will start by telling you our main goal, and that is that nature enhancement in offshore wind farms is the new standard. So we would like that all offshore wind farms are built in a nature inclusive ways. And what are we doing for this? Well, we are working on a toolbox which can also be said to be a handbook for the offshore wind sector to use to effectively and cost efficiently build their offshore wind farms in a nature inclusive way. And for this, we are now running offshore projects. We are working together with most of the offshore operators like Vattenfall, Blauwind, Luchterduinen, TenneT, Ørsted, and Gemini. all these projects have a different focus, which I will come back to later. Next to those projects, we are also working on innovation. We are working on creating source material, oyster spat specifically. We have a North Sea Innovation Lab nearshore, a nearshore test location in which we can deploy new designs and then improve them if needed. And we are also working on the improvement of product designs and monitoring techniques. Next to that, we have a communication pillar in which we work towards the public communication, but also the lobby, so that we have a consolidation within policy. And all this to make nature enhancement in offshore wind farms the new standard. So here's a map with an overview of our projects. You can see all the offshore wind farms in which we are currently operating, and also 2 onshore locations where we are working on flat oyster hatcheries. Next to that, we are working together with Belgium and the UK already, and hope to work with some other countries too after this nice call for collaboration. Good to tell here is that the focus of these projects is different. Some projects really focus on the reef species themselves, others focus on reef associated species, and others focus on reef beneficiaries. So the focus of each project is tailored to really feed into this toolbox so that we can provide a whole story and not only about 1 or 2 organisms. So in this call for collaboration, we defined 3 topics on which we would like to collaborate. We hope you have some reference to these topics. We are really working on the design and starting up new offshore projects. So if you have new ideas on that, please contact us. We are really welcoming new sources of oyster spat, reliable oyster spat, so it should be disease-free and free of invasive species. And we are looking for more effective monitoring techniques as costs are rising. For the further rollout of our project, we are also looking for new ideas to collaborate with policymakers and the wider public, as well as influence the legislation around nature inclusive designs. So this is the end of my presentation. Nice to see everyone again this year. I hope to meet everyone next year in person, and please contact me if you have any further questions or good ideas how to take this further. Thank you so much, Christiaan.
Thank you, Christiaan. Thanks to all speakers. In fact, I would have loved to see everybody. In fact, I'm not seeing anybody, but that's the downside of an online conference. Again, for all participants, the poll that has been presented by Feline is still open. Please use that. It will be open slightly longer than the conference, or than the speakers, the content of the conference. You can still use also the Q&A box and the chat box if you have any comments on NORA and or on the online conference. Thank you also, Feline, for correcting me about you being the Secretariat in persona and adding all the other names of the people involved with the Secretariat, with the advisory board, with the whole community, in fact. And it seems we can fill a whole Christmas party with all the NORA presents. So I'm actually baffled. Looking really good. My apologies for running a bit over time. I guess I can practice on my role as a chair and timekeeper, but we're not finished yet. We're nearing the end of this NORA online conference. I expect we will be closing roughly 15 minutes or perhaps 20 minutes later than expected. So I'm looking at a 12:55 or perhaps 1300 to finish. But we will be moving towards a closing statement. And for that, I have the privilege to introduce the next speaker, the final speaker, which is Professor Dr. Henning van Noordheim. And this should be a familiar name for most or perhaps all of the participants of this conference. Henning is a marine benthic ecologist, and he is a member of the NORA Advisory Board. And as the co-organizer of the first NORA meeting in Berlin in 2017, it is through his collaborative efforts that actually the whole concept and the spirit of NORA was born. And further, he was also instrumental in securing the funding of the native oyster restoration in Germany, the projects running there, but also of the current NORA Secretariat. And Henning was the former head of Department of Marine Conservation of the Federal Conservation Agency of the German government. And he has been teaching and still is at the University of Rostock, Marine Nature Conservation. Henning, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Karel. I hope I can be heard. I don't see myself on the screen so far, but I see at least the bar going up and down. Hello, everyone. It's definitely a great pleasure from my side to address the final words to all of you, to the attendees of this conference. And I hope and I trust that most of the things I'm going to say to you, I also do on behalf of the advisory board members with whom I had several meetings over this year, and we also prepared, of course, this conference. So again, we had a fantastic 2.5 days. I hope you share this view, and those of you who experience maybe speed dating sometime, you probably share at least my feeling that this was a speed dating conference par excellence. We rushed through a really impressive program, but at the same time, it felt we already had the advisory board the interest to have an update what's going on and not to be a substitute of a full conference that all of us would have liked to have with you. So seeing now how many people attended this online conference, almost 200 participants from that many countries around Europe, but far beyond Europe. We had these attendees and of course also presenters from the US. Still, this map also gives us an idea that we have an overwhelming activity field here in Europe. And with my final words, I would still like to create and steer up more interest and engagement, and please spread the news in other countries with traditional oyster countries like France, but Spain, Portugal, and last not least, the Mediterranean, plus the Norwegian coast where we know there are native oyster strands. Please spread the news, say this is a fantastic group of people working, and join the club, because that was what it was about when we organized NORA in 2017, as Carol said. This was the idea of setting this up, this really wonderful gathering of people. Bernadette and I, at that time, I think, didn't dream of the enormous, really positive reaction from your side. Let's go now to the points that we heard in these days. Bruce Hancock, who was always also one of the spiritual fathers of this whole exercise, I must say. And when I sat down with Bruce many years ago about the American experiences, I really felt this is something we should have in Europe, and there we are. So with Bruce, he yesterday listed up the things we heard already, and I just run briefly through them because we again heard, and you saw already the internet reference. We launched two really important masterpieces of this group, this restoration handbook and the biosecurity handbook. We also saw yesterday how many other activities really in Europe are going on right now. And from what we heard yesterday, but also today, we clearly got an overview how various the conditions of native oysters, the conditions of the seabeds, the different artificial activities we just heard about one, are conducted in Europe. But that is what our meeting was and is about. We try to inform each other. We also share our views. We share our findings. And that is what also we learned this half day this morning. We saw that even 4 new really fantastic and urgently needed new working groups are set up for site selection, historical ecology, production and outreach. And again, first insights what these groups are going to do and are already doing are really encouraging. Important is, of course, the further development of our database. Please, again, spread the news. Other people may be interested to become members, at least on the database, be referenced. And this database definitely can be enlarged by further entries. The calls for collaboration, we just heard what new and really important activities are really in the pipeline, and also, of course, questions of further funding of certain projects. And I think Bernadette gave 2 really important indications where we should look further into if we come to European funding. It is no surprise that we also think of the European organization who has also money for nature restoration, like LIFE or other projects. Some other interesting things we learned today is about the status of ongoing projects in UK, France, the Netherlands and Germany, projects we heard already last year about. But this year, we again see that substantial progress was made, really progress that shows us all we are on the right track. And it's fantastic how many people are really engaged in that and are really positive about it. So this brings me to this slide, the aquatic conservation issue that Bill announced. We all desperately were waiting for it. We hope we can have access to it easily next week. And Bill and the Secretariat, I trust you will help us all that we can really get our hands on this volume of aquatic conservation. Very nice to hear about it right now. And of course, also thanks to John Baxter to foster all that. Now, I think one of my last important things to all of you is to tell, of course, the NORA story goes on. NORA 3 was, according to the conditions, this online conference, but the meeting in person, as we experienced in Berlin and in Edinburgh, can't be substituted by anything online. We all know that, and I think all of you are eager to look forward to the upcoming conference, nicely, again, organized and offered to be conducted in the Netherlands. You definitely fixed already the date in your calendar. This next conference, NORA 4, will be in Middelburg in the Netherlands. The advisory board very much and easily agreed to this proposal by Hein Sas, who is really steering this whole upcoming meeting very nicely. And thanks, Hein, especially to you for that, all that you have done so far. You see where the venue will be. A field trip is planned at this moment. And you see also registration deadline is announced. All this, of course, is unfortunately, at these times and these days, pending on one issue, and that is our virus that is accompanying our lives right now. All these plannings we proceed with clearly, straightforward, but you will understand that the decision about the final conditions and the person-to-person meeting will be taken in January 21. And please, for the time being, stay away from questions. Does this conference really be conducted? The advisory board will clearly have an eye on it and clearly discuss that. And we will inform you as soon as we have any new information for you, and that will be definitely not before beginning of next year. Having said that, I would like to come to a very strong wish from my side, and that is that I think the board, I can include, want to thank very much the organizers, which is first the Secretariat with Feline, with Catherine and Bose, but also to Hein and Carol, who were really the, let's say, driving forces from the Netherlands side to make also this NORA 3 really possible, and convince us at the board that it is really important to have this even in an online format. And our technical support for these 2 days, Maximilian and Andreas, without them, you also know that this thing would be hardly run that perfectly and that speedy as it was right now. But last not least, of course, all this doesn't go without funders. And this is a federal agency for nature conservation within a project that Bernadette runs. We could associate funds to the Secretariat. The Netherlands have offered funds and incorporated it. And last not least, the TNC over Booth also allocated quite a substantial amount of money to make this online conference happening. So I really wish to thank all of you for your very enthusiastic contributions, involvement during this conference, and particularly the Czech partners with their interesting question that shows how lively our community and our interests are. But apart from this contributions that you directly did during this conference and your work at home for the benefits of the oysters, we also, and you probably realize that we all did something very good to the environment. Not that our oysters may capture also CO2 once we have spread them all over Europe waters, but we also did a good job by diminishing our carbon footprint through this conference, and we can have a good feeling. I think our CO2 production was relatively low in these 2 days, which would have been different if we would have traveled. However, all of us would like to see us again. Thanks a lot to you. And I think last thing is let's keep sane, stay away from this viruses. And I wish you have a successful next month so you can inform us at our next NORA 4 conference about new, exciting, new results. And I look very much forward to see you all again. And all best wishes to you.